The revised vision statement the UUA will vote on at General Assembly is framed by building on the foundation of love. Building on the foundation of love. But if we mean by that more than Valentine's amour, if we mean more too than loving our loved ones, than love of kin, if we mean a love that opens into a transforming love, then we can't just suppose that a more encompassing human love is just there for us to build on. No. In our world, the larger love that might bring needed transformation is itself in need of foundation. Before we build on the foundation of love, we must look first to the foundation of love. And I'm even going to argue this morning that there's work to be done in building that foundation. The foundation of love is empathy. And we must build empathy. As Jamil Zaki observes in his book, The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World, being a psychologist studying empathy today is like being a climatologist studying the polar ice. Each year we discover more about how valuable it is just as it recedes all around us. I will argue this morning that empathy is the foundation not just of love, but of human society itself. That empathy is a complex phenomenon with feeling at its core, but encompassing thought and action as well. I will argue that empathy can be built, that empathy above that is not a bad thing, as Paul Bloom's recent book Against Empathy argues. I will argue that empathy can only be understood in the way that we live that experience, that empathy can soften the hardening lines of our cultural conflict, that empathy can move not just individuals but whole fields of endeavor, that our vulnerability and even our very suffering can be the greatest community strength for the growth and the transformation that we seek. So that's what I'm going to do in the next little while. 1, empathy is the foundation of love. Babies and their caregivers have a special relationship that's built on hormones and mirror neurons, where these helpless neonates come from an experience that is, as William James put it, a booming, buzzing confusion. But even out of that confusion, they identify human faces early on. And out of those neonates, our society is made because we couldn't have been born when we were ready to be born with the brains that we bring to the birth. Therefore, human society itself is built on our ability to care, to relate to care, to socially institute patterns, including what's called alloparenting, that will allow for the development of those helpless babies from which we all began. When a baby hears other babies crying, it is disturbed by that and often cries, and this is more true of hearing other babies cry than hearing a recording of itself, himself, herself, themselves crying. The experience of other sufferings in an infant moves them in an identifying way. Zaki, whose book I spoke of earlier, says that even 1-year-old children whose parents express high levels of empathy show greater concern for strangers as among 1-year-old children whose parents express high levels of empathy. As 2-year-olds, they show greater concern for strangers and are more able to tune into other people's emotions. As 4-year-olds, they act more generously, and as 6-year-old, I messed this up. I've read this. There's 2-year, 4-year, and 6-year-old measures, but they're good on all the empathy stuff. When the parents are expressive of levels of empathy compared to their peers. So in the structure of empathy, if you will, for empathy to be understood as the complex phenomenon that's more than just a feeling. At the core of that, Franz de Waal, the primatologist, suggests that we think of empathy like a Russian doll that's nested. And in the core of that is the feeling of identification that we might call emotional empathy. Feeling with another, feeling for another. It's the earliest in life, it's the most evolutionary basic, and it's the most instantaneous. It isn't mediated through our higher cognitive functions. A layer around that would be cognitive empathy, where we're thinking into others to understand their experience. It's as if we're saying empathy is a complex phenomenon, a Russian doll, if you will, with the core at its center of emotional empathy, and then around that, if you will, cognitive empathy, where we think almost like a detective from the cues and clues of what another has shared, what's really going on behind that. Outside of that, there's something that we might call motivational empathy, where we want not just to think, oh, that's too bad, but where we're motivated not only to care for the person, but maybe even do something for them, right? Without the active motivational quality of empathy, empathy is just a standing by with our thoughts and prayers as more children get gunned down, right? This layer of motivation toward action fits very well with our Unitarian Universalist sources in the traditions of religion and humanistic sources that speak of compassion, that speak of agape, that speak of karuna, etc. Empathy is not just a fixed trait. It can be built like a skill. It can be cultivated. It's not like a set point, oh, this person is this empathetic. It's more like a range. It's not how you are, but what you can be. There are some outliers. There are sociopaths who just lack that core of emotional feeling, but have excellent cognitive skills. They make great corporate CEOs and are found in high levels of power in our society. At the other side of those outliers are those on the autism scale, which clinically is its own spectrum, who have strong emotional empathy, but where that cognitive empathy is just not natural to them. For most of us, as I noted earlier in our experience, we, as babies on up, feel different degrees of that empathy, but empathy is also a mindset. Believing that you can change your empathy helps to make it so, which is also true of things like intelligence. There's been much research on many factors of empathy, of motivation, of the conditions, and one of the things I found is that carefully thought out nudges can make a huge difference. As an example that's dear to me, as someone who donated a kidney to my brother, in a country that sets the default expectation through the process of driver registration or whatever else, that you will be an organ donor unless you say no, 80% of the people are organ donor volunteers under that scenario. That's a nudge because it's very easy to do. It doesn't require huge, broad campaigns. You just tweak the circumstances a little bit to bring out what is not unnatural to people in the way of an empathetic attitude. I'm going to spend a little more time than I meant to on this next thing because the more I thought about it, the more deeply important I feel it is. Empathy is not a bad thing. There's a recent book by the author of Just Babies, whose work I've even referred to earlier, Paul Bloom, that's titled Against Empathy. Some of the research that I cited was from his book, Just Babies, which he took as evidence for early empathy. In his more recent book, Against Empathy, he basically says, I changed my mind. He says, empathy is morally corrosive. I quote, when you're done with this book, you might ask, what's not wrong with empathy? Wait a minute. If our very survival of humans depends on empathy and on the empathetic bonds of infants and caregivers, the ability of others to have enough empathetic connection to expand those provisions of caregiving at a socially structured level, well, what does Bloom mean by empathy if that can somehow be a bad thing? Well, it turns out that that is the big problem, though not the only one, with his bold thesis. The empathy that Bloom is interested in can be simply put as follows. Empathy is feeling what you think another is feeling, experiencing what they experience. It follows Adam Smith's view from an earlier era. For Bloom, too, we should strive to use our heads rather than our hearts. Does that sound like a familiar distinction of cultural and personal types? One argument is that emotional empathy is easily swayed by our biases. We have empathy more for our in-group, for us and not for them. We have our confirmation bias, we have our proximity bias, we have our now versus later bias. All of these things are very easily swayed. Another problem is that empathy makes us partial to the particular case. We care more about this particular child whose picture is before us than we do about a different condition that may affect more numerous people more severely, might even be more easily fixed, if you will. Bloom says the real problem is that often people don't care about math. I think that's a really telling quotation. The real problem. I'm always suspicious when someone says the real problem, as if there couldn't be more than one, right? People don't care enough about math. Which is to say, cost-benefit analysis, as the Ford Pinto engineers were so good at. Cost-benefit analysis. Empathy, says Bloom, isn't even good at what it wants to be. Empathic suffering is different from real suffering. Adam Smith had pointed out that empathy is different both in degree and in kind. In short, not only can we be good without empathy, from a moral standpoint, we're better off without it. Well, that is an argument worth hearing. A few rejoinders, before I share my own view. First, the reasoning that Bloom trumps and trumpets is subject to our entrenched biases just as much as empathy is. The social psychologist Jonathan Haidt cites extensive research to show that it's really our more primitive brain that decides what we choose to do, that decides our beliefs and leanings and character even before we've made our elaborate rational calculations. That most of our moral reasoning even is an after-the-fact rationalization. Second, if you don't write that check for famine relief, are you really going to spend that money in some more efficient act of charity after you've calculated it on cost-benefit grounds? Or are you just going to spend it on something else? But the most telling argument against Bloom's argument against empathy is one of his own. If what he calls empathy is not the same as feeling what another feels, then he might mean that the problem is we believe they're feeling something, but we get it wrong. Suppose that were the case. Suppose empathy is feeling what you believe someone else feels. Suppose it doesn't work. Then the error on his analysis would not be with the feeling. It would not be with the core of empathy. I'm sorry.
I was just going along with you.
Okay. Sometimes I get carried away.
Carrying me with you there. Sorry.
Calgon, take us all away. The error would be in the cognitive empathy that my detective mind is reading the person wrong. The more he successfully argues there's a difference between the feeling you have and my feeling as someone empathizing with you, the more his entire analysis is based on the wrong thing. He's arguing that when I feel exactly what you feel, that's a problem. Or he's arguing that I can't feel exactly what you feel. I just want to say that isn't what empathy is. Now, Bloom said, I don't care about verbal quibbles. You can call it something else. But this is what I'm talking about, and these arguments hold. I want to say words do matter. As an aspiring author, I want to say to that successful Harvard psychologist, twice published at least author, you're a bastard for titling your book Against Empathy. Because well-intentioned people who are smart, well-educated, well-read, but might not read that book, may assume just from the title or from reviews or from word they've heard that what they think of as empathy is misguided or has been clinically refuted. What is the cultural effect of your title? Words do matter. So I call him out not for his analysis of different things and his nuance, this, that, and the other. I call him out for a reckless slandering and libeling of what I take to be a crucial heart of human experience. So that's why I spoke so much about that part of it. Last time I did this, I called him a bastard. That wasn't in the script. Anyway, let me begin from scratch. Would anyone be able to get me just a little taste of water or some other liquid? My mouth, I forgot my mouth gets real dry when I do these things. Let me begin from scratch. Zaki writes that we are wobbly orbits that never touch each other. Think of empathy the way you would think of gravity in Einstein's relativity theory. The special theory fused our space with our time, so we would speak of space-time for Einstein. The general theory found that the flat planes of Euclid are curved by the gravitational forces of mass energy. That the stuff that's on the plane gives it a different shape if we think in two-dimensional terms. And the same is true three-dimensionally. The same is true four-dimensionally. The gravitation that is intrinsic to mass energy, or at least to the mass part of mass energy, shapes the space-time of our world. This, I think, thank you so much, Kevin. Appreciate it. That's a good way to think about empathy. Now think of two people interacting in a way analogous to those objects of mass. We exert an energy. We influence each other. I might say in terms of empathy, we are moved by each other. Emotional empathy is not that I feel what you feel. It's not that we take the conceptual or the emotional content, we treat it as a fact and transplant it from here to there. It's not that. Emotional empathy is that I am moved by your feeling. My lived space-time bends to you if I'm leaning at all. There's a heaviness to your weight, even if I end up carrying you, brother. It's the gravity of your experience that moves me most. And this is not by an inference. It's not by an action at a distance. It's an immediate relational connection that happens in the experiencing of it without, perhaps except in the case of the sociopath, needing that cognitive layer in order to exist. It's in the very contours. My relationship to you, the way I'm moved by you, is in the very contours of my personal space. We can carry that analogy further, too. Peter Singer argued 40 years ago, and for about the same amount of time I've agreed with him, that moral evolution consists in expanding our circles of care from those closest to those farther and more distant and more different, But that doesn't mean that everyone I care about has equal value in my world, as some mathematicians of morality would prefer. No. The attractive force of empathy has a heart, has a center of gravity. Those whose wobbly orbits are closest to me have a greater gravitational pull for that. And that is as it should be. A lived world with a heart, as opposed to some mathematical utopian abstraction. It is from those closest gravities that empathy evolves its outward radiance to the farther orbits of our fellows. That is growth. But growth comes of opportunity. And opportunity can present as conflict. So point number 6, empathy can soften the conflict and increase understanding and acts of kindness, not just acts, but attitudes, habits, even a character of kindness. One researcher says that the gateway drug for empathy is fiction. I would say stories, fictional or not, because avid readers get good at identifying with characters. I want you to consider, in terms of the gradient of growth and this outward stretching of the orbits of empathy and how that can come from conflict, I want you to consider the conflicted issue of race in our disunited American state. In a 2022 poll, the majority of Republicans said that in the past 5 years, there's been a lot more discrimination against whites. Only 12% of those Republicans polled said the same of blacks. Flip the party and you flip the result, right? I've spoken before of some of the factors that lead us to cluster our beliefs and follow our cognitive dissonance into the security of like-minded fellows. But what if 60 Minutes picked up the following story and gave it the full 60-minute treatment, and the same people saw that? Colorado black ranchers Nicole and Courtney Mallory. Suppose they were interviewed and that 60 Minutes showed pictures of poisoned, beheaded, disemboweled, and butchered dogs and goats and cattle that were found on their ranch. Suppose they reported on the 170 phone calls to 9/11 that went unanswered or were hung up on, the 19 complaints that evoked no police response, the Facebook posts to block the roads around their ranch so no one could get out, the fences that were cut, the surveillance cameras jammed, the people run off the road or chased down like North by Northwest. Nicole recently saw from her shower as a white man jumped the fence, entered the house without knocking, but the man was surprised by a wet, naked black woman with a shotgun. The Mallorys refuse to move. They fly 3 banners along their 1,000-acre property. United States Marine Corps. Jesus is King. Black lives matter. 2 out of 3 is bad. It sickens Nicole to think that she sat in a foxhole to fight for people like this, but it didn't stop them from donating lots of food during the pandemic when the local stores were offering food that was beyond its expiration. New development in that beautiful, gorgeous Colorado country. They've both been issued felony warrants, and the NAACP plans to get involved. It is reported. Suppose that a group of those same surveyed people who see things in the way that I first reported as Republican, it's pretty hard to think that if they watched a full 60 Minutes style report on that only 10% would say that blacks are discriminated against a lot more than whites. It seems to me that that's the kind of story that influences how we feel about our world, not just how we conceptualize it in theory and ideology. Not only do stories, not only does empathy, not only does the attitude and the expectation of that connection shape our individual lives. Whole fields can be shaped by that. I recently watched a series that was in preparation for a year and a half by the National Institute for the Clinical Application of Behavioral Medicine. They're clinician focused. They deal with clients who experience trauma. The focus of their work is how do people get better? And they put together a program on racial trauma that spanned over 4 hours that I watched through. And it included structural racism, intergenerational racism, internalized racism, all the things that public school teachers are not allowed to address in this state as realities that you must understand to try to help someone who's been through it. So the clinical field of trauma treatment, all the experts that are most influential and best known and most published, have a clear perspective on this that may not be the same as Harvard researchers who aren't clinicians in that same way. The field is changing from the point of human contact, from the clinical side. That change is happening. There's post-traumatic growth, not post-traumatic stress. There's empathy that's born of suffering. There's empathy as a dimension of growth and even of transformation. We might think of it as going from the basic respect that our first principles celebrates and insists on to an empathetic connection and even toward that transforming love of compassion, karuna, agape. Karen Armstrong, the 2011 General Assembly speaker who's written so much great stuff on comparative religion, started the Charter for Compassion, or charterforcompassion.org, with tremendous resources, and she has a book called 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life that she autographed for me at that General Assembly. I could say so much more about empathy, about its importance, about where it goes, about how we cultivate it, how it works, how we grow it. But the crucial thing is that we do not turn against empathy. We do not turn away from empathy. As that beautiful Rumi quote had from earlier about the point is not to seek, your job is not to seek love, but to seek within yourself the barriers against it. What a perfect thing to apply here, that we need to embrace empathy, we need to practice empathy. Is that our best hope to be a movement of transforming love? I'll steal a trick from my old geometry book. The proof is left to you. Thank you.